Hi there. Welcome to our MidWeek podcast for Mill Creek Foursquare Church. I'm Jon. I'm here with Pastor Trevor.
What's going on?
And this is our second episode in our series of podcast conversations on the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, corresponding to our new sermon series called Rebuilders, a study in Ezra and Nehemiah. In our first episode in discussing these books and this new sermon series, Trevor and I spent a little bit of time talking about sort of two major questions or two major issues. One, why should anybody care about studying books like Ezra and Nehemiah? What do books like this have to offer us? And not only that generally, but also why might we, as a very specific community of faith in a specific place in the 21st century, turn to these books or these texts specifically at this time? So why Ezra and Nehemiah? Why now? Mm-hmm. What do we hope to learn? How do we hope to be shaped and informed by our scriptures in this particular season by these specific books? We also spent a little bit of time trying to situate the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, or the story that these texts tell, within the larger biblical narrative, the larger story of the scriptures as a whole, and specifically the Old Testament. So we talked a little bit about how the central theme, if you will, of the Old Testament story has to do with God being in covenant relationship with his people. The central sort of crisis of the Old Testament storyline is this experience of exile as divine judgment, which kind of throws everything into disarray and causes lots of questions to come up about the identity of God's people, the future of God's people, the potential future or not of God's covenant with these people, and all of those kinds of things. And so we talked about how Ezra and Nehemiah don't just sort of drop out of nowhere, but exist specifically within this story and engage with or introduce themes associated with the regathering of people after exile, the reconstitution of a people in covenant relationship with God, the rediscovery of Torah or God's law or guidance, the rebuilding of temple as the locus or the specific site of God's presence in the midst of God's people. All of these kinds of things have significance precisely because of this larger story that they're a part of. In this episode, our goal is to spend a bit of time talking somewhat more specifically about the precise subject matter of Ezra and Nehemiah. We've talked about what larger story they're a part of, but what story do these books, or this sort of two-part narrative, what does it tell? What's the story that Ezra and Nehemiah itself tells? That kind of thing. One of the reasons it's helpful to pay close attention to what the narrative of these books is and how it functions and some of the detail is that we sometimes have a tendency to treat the Bible in ways that involve not paying close attention to what's actually...
Really, Jon? People do that?
what's sort of actually going on in the text. But we sometimes use, or you could even say sort of abuse the Bible by coming to it with our own project, our own ideas, our own sense of what we would like to find there, and then finding ways of making that be there.
Who would ever do that, Jon?
So, I think it's a pretty consistent thing. I think I probably fall into it from time to time too. I would suggest, and I think a lot of people would agree, that two of the most common ways that sort of contemporary evangelical readers of the Bible, and probably also contemporary charismatic, sort of broadly speaking, folks tend to, when folks within these traditions turn to Ezra and Nehemiah, probably two of the most common approaches are to either think, oh, well, these are important leaders, and we care a lot about leadership broadly in sort of our culture and businesses and government, but also more narrowly within the context of the church. So a lot of people will treat Ezra and Nehemiah as if, oh, these give us like leadership lessons or leadership principles. And so we can just look at these books, distill some leadership guidelines, and then apply them today. Or more broadly speaking, maybe folks will sometimes look at Ezra and Nehemiah and think, oh, okay, well, they're about rebuilding, just like our sermon series topic or title. And so we might think, oh, well, we'll just turn to this book or these books and find a fairly sort of straightforward, maybe fairly linear program for rebuilding, right?
Newest building campaign or something,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Here's how you do it in 12 steps.
Yeah, so those are two of the most, unfortunately, two of the most common ways of sort of approaching these books, but also maybe not the most helpful ways.
And that is totally reflected in the titles for the books, right? I mean, here's a few titles just to give you. If you go on Amazon, you look up Ezra and Nehemiah.
People who are writing about
Ezra
yeah.
and Nehemiah. Nehemiah, becoming a godly leader, revive us again. Or becoming a God leader, revive us again, a study of Ezra and Nehemiah. Rebuild the walls, lessons in leadership from Nehemiah. Ezra, a biblical model for restoration. The Nehemiah factor. This is my favorite. 16 vital keys to living like a missional leader. Nehemiah, becoming a disciplined leader. Overcoming fear and discouragement with Ezra and Nehemiah. This is the best one. Leadership for greatness. Leadership lessons from the book of Nehemiah. And so, I mean, these are contemporary kind of evangelical authors writing about this. And it's nothing against the authors themselves per se. And it's not even that the book doesn't have some positive portrayals of leadership or things we can learn from that. But you're hitting on that kind of overall wholesale acceptance of this book tells us exactly how to rebuild. Here's the 12 steps to do it. And it's almost always an overly optimistic observation around the book.
Yeah. I think probably the two of the biggest problems is one is it's potentially overly optimistic and overly sort of simplistic to imagine that there's just some neat and tidy principles that we can distill within these books and then just extract them and apply them to our lives.
It's a very American thing.
Yeah.
Western,
And I think in contrast to that, we want to look a little bit more closely at the text and see how leadership, for example, is portrayed or see how the rebuilding project is portrayed. And I think one of the things that we have to take seriously when we look closely and pay careful attention to books like Ezra and Nehemiah is that there are elements of tension and ambiguity throughout these books on multiple levels. They aren't. I mean, and this occurs in a number of different ways. I mean, even at the level of the narrative and the chronology, these are not linear books. If you read them. For those of us who have read them before or who are reading through them right now, you've probably noticed they can be sort of frustrating to read. They don't tell a neat and tidy sort of linear narrative that says, here's a rebuilding project, here's how it works. Yeah. People did it. It was real successful.
Oh,
now
you can
go and do it too.
There's starts and stops. There's even within the chronology. If you actually look at the chronology, the sequencing, there's years, there's decades between events happening.
It jumps around a bit.
Yeah.
You have at least 3 different Persian kings who are involved at different points. And at times you're sort of moving forward in time and moving back in time. So there's tension and ambiguity there, the way that the narrative kind of jumps around. It's not linear. There's also a strange combination of genres in these texts. At some level, it's a narrative overall speaking, but sometimes it's first-person narrative that's almost like a memoir from these significant figures. Sometimes it's third-person narrative. At times, we just sort of jump into a list or a genealogy. At times, we have these strange collections of formal edicts or sort of proclamations from these Persian kings. Even at the level of language, these books are strange. In their original languages, they're not all written in Hebrew like most Old Testament books, but there are these pockets of Aramaic language. Aramaic is a closely related Semitic language, closely related to Hebrew. But it still is somewhat strange to have one book that has these two closely related languages, and it's just sort of jumping back and forth between them. So there are a number of sort of tensions and ambiguities within the text, even just the way that the narrative is told, the way that the narrative progresses. Even the fact that, in our first episode, we talked a little bit about this big picture of kind of exile and return, or exile and restoration, which is These are dynamics that shape the overall Old Testament narrative. And that's true and helpful as a broad framework. But if we get a little bit more specific, and if we pay close attention to the biblical texts associated with telling the story of exile and restoration, what we see is that nothing's quite as simple as just, all of the people of God were taken into exile and the land was totally empty, and then all of the people returned and things were great. And rather, the exile took place in a kind of multi-stage reality over a number of centuries. And we learn in books like 1st and 2nd Kings that some people remained in the land. We also learn that the Assyrian Empire, who took some of the northern kingdom into exile, also repopulated portions of the land of Israel with people from other places. And then when we come to Ezra and Nehemiah, we learn that it's not as if sort of everybody just returns. We have a portion. They're sometimes called a remnant or survivors of the exile, a portion of the people who end up returning. And so if you imagine this picture, if not everybody left, and if over the centuries what had been the land of Israel was populated by folks who remained, but also various other people from other places, and then you have only a partial group of folks returning, this is a much more complicated picture than just returning and rebuilding and sort of getting on with it.
Yeah, it's muddied waters, it feels like.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And so I think one of the things that we want to do is pay close attention to the tensions and ambiguities in the book, and not imagine, because I think, and here's probably the most important thing to say in all of this, is that the danger, I think the ever-present danger for us in reading the Bible is that we will sort of have our own sense of what we want it to say or what we want to do, and then we will look to the Bible to kind of justify or support or inform some project or intention we've already decided upon. And those books you listed on Amazon, some of them are probably helpful and probably have helpful information in them. But I think that the danger that we have to be aware of is that we might have our own sort of modern Western ideals of what true leadership looks like, or we might have our own contemporary, maybe even idiosyncratic sense of what we think rebuilding or revival ought to look like. And then we might look to books like this and try to force them or sort of coerce them to say what we want them to say, or to illuminate or justify something we've already decided on our own terms. And I think one of the things that I think we want to invite people into is to wrestle with the real tensions and ambiguities and specific details within these books.
And the ambiguities are really present within the rhythm of the book, right? Within the movements of the book. You embedded within the structure of the book is ambiguity. Like that's where the stories lead. When you kind of I know we wanted to step into Ezra and Nehemiah, and we started to think of the idea of like the bigger picture of the book, or the book's obviously one unified narrative. And that's an important thing to say as we even talk about the structure. I mentioned this in our last episode, is that these books in the earliest manuscripts were in Greek and Hebrew, were one unified story, right? Now, it doesn't make a big difference for most readers, at least in their English Bibles, because they're right next to each other. They seem to be telling the same story. So for most people, they would just read to the next one. They'd be like, oh, these relate, or something like that. But when you start to get into that they're one story, it changes how you think of the structuring of it. And it starts to say, oh, I actually see these as one unified story that's telling maybe three movements within it. Because when you get within the books, these two books unified as one book, I know it's a bit complicated when we explain it that way or something, but there are three main movements throughout the book. Ezra chapters 1-6 open us up into the recounting of the rebuilding of the temple, and led by Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel in Ezra 1-6 around 538 BCE. And really what that movement, I define it as it's all about the presence, in the sense that you think of the idea of the temple, you think of the structure that was the temple. The temple was the very place where heaven met earth. It was the very place that the tangible, palpable presence of God dwelled among the people. And so in one sense, there's a sense that there's a first things first principle, I would say, in the sense that we're rebuilding around what is core and kind of rebuilding out. And so you see the temple or the presence, and then in Ezra chapter 7 through 10, you see Ezra leading the next part of the rebuilding efforts. And you see I really would say the rebuilding of the people, in the sense of there's a rebuilding of the community, and a community under the Torah, right? A community under the law, that they're being reformed and reshaped by. You see the first Ezra's application of the scripture, and even maybe the first examples of expository preaching, or however you want to define that, but the sense of using scripture to apply it to a group of people,
Sure.
and the proclamation of it. And then in the first part of Nehemiah chapters 1 through 7, you see what I call the rebuilding of the protection, right? It's kind of the rebuilding of the city and the walls. It's a rebuilding of, in many ways, the rebuilding efforts are kind of inside out, right? It's the presence, it's the temple, it's the people around the Torah, and then it's the protection, it's the external realities that protect the city as well. And so you see the book arranged around these three movements of rebuilding. And the interesting thing about the movements of rebuilding is that they all tell the same story in a broad strokes, the same story three times. So when you start to get to the broader structure, they all start in a similar way. It's God providentially leading a Persian king to allow Israelites to return and rebuild. And so you see over this kind of 100-year period, these different Persian kings responding to rebuild. And then you see right away the people return, but the Israelites face opposition, right? There's some sort of opposition that's taking place within the rebuilding efforts. And then you see, though, like the opposition's overcome. And this is the part maybe we're in our Western sensibilities. We'd be like, yes, this is the part, like this is true leadership. You overcame, you made something happen. But then this is where things kind of unravel, or the ambiguity is introduced, is all three movements end with an anticlimactic resolution. Each movement ends in a way that you almost wish it didn't end that way, in the sense of if it was a true, like, this is true leadership, here's how you make something happen. I mean, you think of in Ezra 1 through 6, the mixed response to the temple when they lay the foundation. And we talked about in our last podcast episode that it's not like everyone's rejoicing and they're like, we did it. It's a mixed bag of reactions. You even see the rejection of local support. And even when the opposition, it's a mixed bag when you think of the opposition, when you actually kind of unpack that idea of, should they oppose? Should they have allowed people to come in to help rebuild? It's a mixed bag in some ways. You think in Ezra 7 through 10, Ezra 9 and 10 opens up this story of Ezra telling people to divorce, or the people, someone else is bringing it to Ezra first, but to divorce spouses. And that's a very complex story. So I'm not trying to make it overly simplistic. But there's they're taking scripture from the Pentateuch and they're trying to apply it to a situation that is different than the original situation. And so they're trying to apply scripture. And you see just this strange story of this story ending of people leaving their spouses and their kids. And it seems like a strange ending to this rebuilding effort. And then you see in the story of Nehemiah that there's this... he's rejecting local assistance. And you get to actually Nehemiah 13 in the end of the book of these two books. And you see that every systemic thing they had rebuilt, you start to see unravel in the end. And it introduces you to the story. You start to ask, by the end of Nehemiah, you ask the question, is this actually the fulfillment? Like, how should we read these stories? It seems like a strange way to build a narrative, especially if you wanted to build a narrative that was 12 lessons to leadership or something like that. And so I guess, John, it raises the question, why are the narratives this way?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I don't think we could presume to have
the
sort
mind
of
of God.
Precise answer to sort of why God would inspire something to be written this way, or why the people who were involved in putting it together did it this way. But I think even before addressing the exact question, why would it be structured this way, I think what you've done for us is sort of illustrated that paying close attention to how the narrative functions, to what actually happens and what doesn't, should cause us to be a little bit wary of imagining that these are just, the biblical equivalent to that popular book,
John Maxwell,
Seven Habits of Highly Effective People or something, right? Like, if one was telling a story like that, it would probably be important to have everything work out in the end, so that the logic of sort of like, look, they did this, they applied these principles, everything worked out. Now you go and do the same. The very fact that there's this ambiguity, that there's these tensions, complicates that desire that we might have to treat books like these as a sort of 12-step program for restoring and rebuilding, or 8 or 7 highly effective leadership principles from the Old Testament or something like that. I think one way to answer the question, why would books like this be structured this way? I mean, one answer would be to sort of explore or to maybe just make the point that perhaps this book or these books illustrate, just like a number of other biblical books do, just how infrequent it is that biblical books were put together in a way that was sort of like one person writing at one time. And just sort of, I think we sometimes, because we receive and read the Bible in a certain way, like, oh, I'm reading this book. Now this book has ended. I'm going to start reading this one. Yeah, we get it all put together, that sometimes obscures the reality that the composition or the authorship, the coming into existence of most of these books or texts actually took place often over long periods of time, often involved multiple authors, perhaps multiple editors even being involved in the preservation and transmission of some of these texts over long periods of time. And if we pay close attention to books like Ezra and Nehemiah, they look less like, someone was following, Ezra had some assistant who was following along with the action and was furiously writing down everything that took place to make sure it wasn't forgotten or something like that. It looks more like traditions associated with this time period of return and restoration and rebuilding, and traditions associated with these significant leadership figures like Ezra, Nehemiah, Zerubbabel, some of the other folks involved, that were collected over a long period of time. And the way that you described the kind of structure, these 3 movements that each have significant elements of correspondence, seems to reflect that kind of thing in terms of the composition of a book like this. That these 3 movements, or these the way that the book has been structured, is sort of oriented around telling the same story in multiple movements, or telling the same kind of story in a number of different ways, and showing that similar kinds of patterns happen over and over when the people of God seek to partner with God and engage in these processes of rebuilding, restoration, recovery, that kind of thing. And so I think that's one thing to say, is it seems to suggest a much more complicated picture of how books like this came into existence and what they were even for, than just someone writing a leadership manual in the ancient world.
To say to that too, so the part of composition, I actually, when I hear you articulate that, sometimes feel bristle, kind of like, oh, there are multiple hands in the pot or something over a period of time. But I actually have learned to value that as a greater view of inspiration, in the sense that there is, over these long stretches of periods, there were multiple kind of generations or communities who reflected on, who thought about this within their own cultural context, and came to these points of understanding through the inspiration of the Spirit to say, this is what this means for us as kind of from generation to generation. And I actually learned to value that even more so, because it puts a text within conversation of multiple communities and peoples who are making sense of what this text means for the community of faith in their day. And I see that actually as a place of value within our view of inspiration in some ways, that it makes it beyond like that. I think we talk about this in Revelation, but a picture of a person getting struck by lightning and just have tablets all of a sudden writing there or something. But it actually adds a value of, I would say, trustworthiness when I think of the scriptures. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of ways it's it's not necessarily any less supernatural or miraculous to imagine the Spirit guiding and superintending a long process of oral and written traditions coming together to form the books that are now in our Bibles. That's no less miraculous or supernatural or the kind of thing that God would do than God inspiring sort of one person to write one thing at one time. So certainly, I think, and definitely these kinds of realities fit very well within an Orthodox Christian understanding of the inspiration of the Scriptures. I think also the way that the book functions and the way that you described this overarching structure can help us to understand what they might be intended to communicate in terms of, again, maybe not providing a sort of step-by-step set of leadership principles or a program for rebuilding where you just, follow this and this will happen or that kind of thing, but rather a series of glimpses into what it looks like when the people of God seek to engage in this kind of work. I think what that can do for us is it can highlight the importance of discernment when the people of God are in maybe analogous situations to the folks that we meet on the pages of Ezra and Nehemiah, or just more broadly when the people of God find themselves in a moment of seeking revival or seeking to rebuild or seeking to sort of reconstitute identity in some kind of a way. When we are faced with something like a series of glimpses, then what that communicates is less like, here's a bunch of things. You just need to go and do these things. And it's more like, here's a window into what it looked like when Zerubbabel and Sheshbazzar were sort of involved. And the project they were involved in was the rebuilding of the altar and the foundations. And like you said, there will be elements of both of God's sovereignty in sort of bringing this about. There might be elements of leadership that are really sort of positive, but there might also be elements of opposition and elements of sort of anticlimactic, this didn't turn out quite the way we had hoped or thought it would. And then you get a window into a different, a slightly different component of that larger time frame with Ezra, and then another window with Nehemiah. And so what we begin to see is less like, one predetermined program for restoration or rebuilding that we're just supposed to follow, and more like a series of glimpses or a series of windows that we might then engage with as a kind of resource for our own discernment in our own contexts and situations.
I think that actually makes it widens the applicability of the book in many ways, I would say, where it's not just this narrow, here's the 12 steps you do to be successful or something, but it actually says across your cultural, it invites us almost into the discernment process. It feels like, because it's showing us, here's how these leaders discerned the reality, the process, the ever-growing realities of applying scripture within a new context, within a new culture, with kind of in a sense of the muddied picture we've talked about before of like the returning to land and such. And so I think it widens the applicability in some ways too, because it starts to say, okay, you enter into ambiguity. Here's what you learned from our ancestors of how they've done that. And here's 3 different pictures of that. And here's the good and the bad parts of that.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, I think a great example of that. I mean, in our first episode, we talked a little bit about how, on the one hand, we can't just say, our situation's exactly like these returnees in the post-exilic Persian period. But on the other hand, we can and probably should search for and carefully analyze possible elements of correspondence or analogous situations. I mean, that's what we do when we read the Bible as Christians, right? We don't just say, I'm exactly like Abraham. My world is exactly like his, or I'm exactly like Rebecca. And so like that kind of thing. But we do, when we read the Bible carefully, we do discern elements of correspondence or analogy or ways in which, life is like and unlike it was at that time. And our situation might be really different, but we do serve this same God who has ultimately the same purposes and what it means for us to be the people of God and to be that people faithfully will and should have really significant elements of correspondence. And so that's part of what we're seeking to do when we read the Bible as Christians. And I think along these lines, one of the elements of the book of Ezra and Nehemiah that we could potentially explore in some detail in terms of seeking possible analogies for today is that, what we meet in these books, a community of God's covenant people who are seeking to recover or reestablish a sense of identity and mission. And they're often doing so in relation to other people who have their own sort of sense of identity or what they want to accomplish. You mentioned earlier that they sometimes will face opposition. There are the people of the land that are involved in the story. There are the Persian kings and governors and various people who are involved in the story. And I think one way that we as the people of God might sort of look to books like Ezra and Nehemiah and think about our own contexts and situations is to think about what our posture is toward what we define as kind of secular culture. Right? Because we find ourselves as the people of God seeking to understand and cultivate and maintain a sense of our identity as God's people, as the people who follow Jesus, the people who are empowered by the Spirit, the people who bear witness to the gospel and the kingdom of God. And we do so in ways that involve, to sort of use the words of Jesus, being sort of within or in the midst of this broader world and culture, but not just sort of it or of the same substance or of the same identity and outlook and worldview and that kind of thing. And I think on the pages of Ezra and Nehemiah, we see a number of different glimpses into possible postures toward what the people of God deem as sort of outsiders. Do we allow them to be part of the building project when they want to be involved? Do we hold them at arm's length? Is it important for us to sort of build walls figuratively or metaphorically? Even the issue of intermarriage and that kind of thing, which, as you said, is a really complicated part of this book that crops up a couple of times. But I don't think there's going to be easy answers to any of these, but the whole point is that it's not as if we just look to these books and go, oh, well, they built a wall, so we ought to build a
totally.
wall.
It's not like haters going to hate, right?
Yeah.
Like, okay, there's opposition. You know what? Haters get behind me, I'm moving forward, right? That's not the point, right? There's an ambiguous picture,
Exactly. And so I think if we think in terms of, okay, we're being given a number of glimpses into things that maybe were done well and maybe were done poorly, or things that maybe were faithful to what it means to be God's covenant people, and things that maybe compromised that identity and mission. And so as we discern or seek to discern what it might look like for us in a contemporary context, we might these books might be really significant resources for us to kind of engage with those glimpses and discern what the Spirit of God might be guiding us into in our own framework as well.
I find that so helpful, right? Because it's the muddied waters actually are speaking to us as a people to say, these are like the waters you swim in the sense of these are relatable, and you're trying to navigate what does it mean to be the people of God, and what those two words you used last week, identity and mission. What does it mean to be a people who are forming our identity in the midst of the context that we find ourselves in this ambiguous situation that it means to be in a secular kind of post-Christian reality? Like, how do you navigate those waters? And so with the people, I find that very helpful. I think what you're talking about with the people also relates to the leaders themselves as well, because we see this muddied picture of leadership in the sense of the leaders that are leading the people of God are just as broken as the people. And you see this ambiguous endings or these anticlimactic endings with, especially when you look at like an Ezra or a Nehemiah, where Nehemiah's ending and he's, pulling out people's hair and saying, remember me, and that kind of thing. You start to enter into this picture of these leaders have certain highlights, like both of them have incredible highlights. I mean, Ezra, when you're seeing him call the people back to the Torah, and like, it seems like a very gleaning moment of something we should glean from in Ezra's life. Yet there's also these pictures of leaders in tension, and that in some ways the human problem of sin, of selfishness, of human and even leaders' own issues conflate the issues of even when the Spirit's stirring, that it's almost, I heard one person say maybe it's revival gone wrong, in the sense that there's a genuine stirring of the Spirit, there's a genuine work of God. Yet we see again throughout history that leaders, they have their own issues, and they conflate that in some ways, good and bad, right? And I find that with my own leadership, right? There's days where I know I have these moments I can look back and say, man, I had a really good day as a leader. There's something that people could learn from here. Yet there's also days in my bad days where there's points I don't really want to remember within my own leadership. And I think that ambiguity within the story invites us to see leaders in the same way, that we start to look at, even over the last year when you see leaders fall into moral failure or something, right? And it's hard to watch a leader who you've seen lead thousands of Christ or have these incredible, what you'd say incredible ministries in the sense of there's been a fruitfulness, and maybe you would say God's hand was on that ministry or something like that. But then you just see these scandals of things that take place, and it enters you into the ambiguity of Christian leadership in the midst of our culture.
Yeah.
And the pitfalls, the positives, but also the pitfalls of any leader.
Yeah, I think that's helpful, and I think part of the tension that you're getting at here that certainly is on display in these books is that I think we like to think sometimes we gravitate towards simplicity and easy polarities, right? And so we like to say, we want to be able to say, well, either God's hand was in this or God's hand wasn't, or God's hand is in this or it isn't, right? Like we want to be able to say things and paint things in that sort of in those black and white terms. But I think books like Ezra and Nehemiah sort of won't quite let us do that. I mean, it's very clear that God's overarching plan and sort of stirring up of people, from his own covenant people to the Persian king that allows them to return in the first place, it's clear that God's hand is involved and is guiding things. And yet it's not clear that sort of everything, and the narrative doesn't sort of provide some kind of specific evaluation at every point or at the conclusion of each component of the story, saying, "Yep, this happened exactly as God wanted it to," and it doesn't give us what Genesis 1 gives us. God saw what was happening and said it was good, right? And so it leaves us in this place of ambiguity, but also in this place of discernment. And I think that maybe is one of the final things we could say about what having books that are structured this way, or books that sort of guide us through the narrative in this particular way. Part of what it does for us is that these sort of unfinished and anticlimactic elements of Ezra and Nehemiah can and should remind us that ultimately, when we pray for or hope for something like revival or restoration or rebuilding, we can't just co-opt those words and try to sort of make them happen on our own terms. We need to learn how to discern and recognize what God might be doing, and then partner with God as God's covenant people. I think one of the things that books like this teach us is that ultimately we're called, whether we think of ourselves as leaders or part of the community more broadly, we are not called to accomplish things for God, right? We're called to partner with God. We're not, we're not to just sort of accomplish some kind of building project, some kind of leadership or discipleship program, or even a kind, stirring up a kind of national or global revival. These are things that we might want to see happen, and they might be good desires to some extent. But there's always going to be this temptation that we can sort of accomplish those things on our own terms or under our own power. And I think books like this sort of remind us just how complex realities like that can be, and force us again to kind of reckon with the reality that we're called not to accomplish such things on our own, but to align ourselves with God and God's purposes.
Amen.
So maybe to close out this episode, we've talked a little bit about we kind of set it up talking about some of the ways that people will commonly approach these books. We suggested that maybe those popularized approaches don't always take seriously the specificity and the ambiguities and tensions of the books. You gave us a bit of an overview of how these books are structured, and we've spent a little bit of time discussing why that might be the case. In light of all we've talked about, how might you kind of distill for us what's valuable about these books? What do these books have to offer us as Christians? Why should we spend the time reading, trying to understand them, and trying to hear in and through these books what the Lord might speak to us today?
Yeah, there's numerous things we could say to that. I said this in our last episode, and I think it holds true still in this way to this conversation, is these books are very human in the sense of they're very divine in the sense of God inspired them, but they're relatable to our circumstances and situations. And these, whether it be the leaders, whether it be the people in general, there's something, and maybe the culture as well.
Sure.
There are these levels that the ambiguity of these books invite us into the human story, and really any human not named Jesus. I mean, like, any human is a mixed bag. You look at Abraham, you look at David, you look at all these figures throughout the scriptures. And a lot of times what we like to do is like I have the children's Bible for my kids. And most of the stories are positive portrayals of these characters, have faith like Abraham, be a man after God's own heart like David or something. Yet when you actually study the pictures of each character, I mean, it's complicated. I mean, you see things Abraham does trying to sell his wife away multiple times. And you say, that's complicated. David and Bathsheba and all that. I mean, it's complicated, right? And I think these books, like the rest of the biblical story, in one way, they invite us into a story that actually relates to us as humans. That on our best days, each of us are a bit of mixed bag. And I find that in myself, right? There's some days where I feel the highs of like, man, I've got this all, I've got it together, or something. And there's other days where I just feel the lows of like, man, I don't know what I'm doing, right? Whether it be my parenting and my marriage, leadership within our community, other things. And the story invites us into that, which is a connection point. The other point too is that the story also points us forward. And we'll talk more about this in future episodes, but it teaches us there are principles that we can learn about rebuilding and all the above. And there are positive portrayals in the book. We don't mean to say that the whole thing, like there are good things, and we'll be preaching on in the series, positive things that we can learn from these books. Yet the books, because of the ambiguity, also point us forward to say there's actually a future fulfillment. And actually, it's not just about us rebuilding, but it points us forward to the true rebuilder. It points us forward to the one who is the true temple of God. It points us forward to the one who is the one who can actually rebuild in a way that we can't. And and we'll talk more about this later in the series and in the podcast, but it points us forward to Jesus, right? And not just in a preachable platitude, like the whole Bible points us to Jesus. But there's actually, when you start to get with Chronicles and Ezra Nehemiah and kind of the shaping of the Hebrew Bible and such, it does point us forward in many very tangible ways that sets our expectation, to set our hope, to say we actually need one who is the true rebuilder of the community of God, and that's the person of Jesus. And I would say that actually, in the sense of the ambiguity of the relatability to us today, it points us to the one we actually need to rebuild, that ultimately we need a genuine work. We need Jesus to work, and we need a genuine move of the Spirit that is, and obviously as humans, we complicate that. I mean, I complicate that. We get in the way of that as well. But it does point us forward to say we know the one who truly can rebuild, and that is the picture of Jesus, who's building his church, right? Who's building the temple, us as a new temple, as a community of faith. And so it sets our hope in many ways forward.
That's great. Well, thanks for listening. We've enjoyed kind of setting the stage in these first couple episodes for what we're trying to get at in this sermon series, and also what we hope the books of Ezra and Nehemiah might speak to us and reveal to us in this particular season in the life of our church. This episode, as usual, was produced by Dave Sproul. It was edited by Tim Machura, and we have music from Sherry Machura. Take care.
Thank you for joining us, and should you want more information or to engage with us further, please go to mc4s.org for more.